On a bitterly cold April day in 1626, two men were travelling in a carriage up Highgate Hill to the north of the City of London. One of them was Sir Francis Bacon, poet, playwright, statesman, lawyer, philosopher, and sometime Lord Chancellor of England. Bacon was possessed of an inquiring mind and was a great proponent of the argument that scientific knowledge should be based solely upon inductive reasoning and careful observation of events in nature, which might sound a little academic and dull, but which was to prove hugely important in endowing London with one of its most unique hauntings. The other person in the carriage, well, he's not that important at the moment, albeit he will become pivotal to our story a little later on, as his involvement in that day's events would help bring about the death of his companion and give us what was quite literally London's first cold case. So, as I don't wish to ruffle your feathers any further, let us make our way to the North London village of Highgate to uncover the strangely chilling story of London's most bizarre and unusual haunting, or as one commentator on Facebook described it, London's crappiest ghost. Highgate's Pond Square, the location for this exquisitely bizarre ghostly tale, is pretty enough, towered over as it is by imposing trees and hemmed in by an eclectic mix of properties, some of which date back to the 18th century, albeit the cars and vans that park alongside or drive past it tend to detract a little from the bucolic air that it would otherwise possess. It gets its name from the ponds that once stood here, which were created by the extraction of sand and gravel over the centuries. However, these were filled in the 19th century, and nowadays it is difficult to picture what it must have looked like in those halcyon bygone days of yore, when it was a truly rural location. That established, let us return now to that cold April day in 1626, as Sir Francis Bacon and his carriage mate, Dr. Winterbourne, physician to the King, were heading up Highgate Hill, Bacon's synapses firing furiously at the scientific conundrums that were all about him. Now, before anyone comments on the scientific inaccuracy of that last statement, I would just like to point out that, according to Google AI, if you are writing creative fiction, poetry, or casual prose, the phrase synapses firing furiously is perfectly fine as a metaphor for intense mental activity. It communicates a vivid, fast-paced image of thought. However, if you are a neuroscientist using it in a report, you're fired, matey. But back to the carriage. John Aubrey, chronicler of the doings of the rich and famous, detailed what happened that day in his Brief Lives, written between 1681 and 1693. Snow lay upon the ground, and it came into my lord's thoughts why flesh might not be preserved in snow as in salt. They were resolved they would try the experiment presently. They alighted out of the coach and went into a poor woman's house at the bottom of Highgate Hill and bought a hen and made the woman exenterate it and then stuffed the body with snow, and my lord did help to do it himself. The snow so chilled him he immediately fell so ill that he could not return to his lodgings, I suppose then at Gray's Inn, but went to the Earl of Arundel's house at Highgate, where they put him into a good bed warmed with a pan, but it was a damp bed that had not been lain about a year before, which gave him such a cold that in 2 or 3 days he died of suffocation. Now, to be honest, I haven't got the foggiest idea if that is how John Aubrey actually spoke. I mean, I didn't know the man, so it's just my interpretation of what I think he sounded like. But in a nutshell, what Aubrey tells us happened is that Bacon, wanting to prove that freezing could preserve meat, purchased a chicken from an old woman, had it slaughtered, stuffed it full of snow and ice, proved his scientific point but caught a cold doing so, invited himself into the Highgate home of Thomas Howard, 14th Earl of Arundel, who, given that he was at the time a prisoner in the Tower of London, had little say in the matter, was put into a damp bed, which led to pneumonia, from which Sir Francis Bacon died on the 9th of April 1626, which also happened to be Easter Sunday that year. Bacon was buried in St. Michael's Church, St. Albans. History doesn't record what became of the chicken. My guess is that it graced the Easter table of a village family, although I do hope that they remembered to ensure it had fully thawed before cooking, as salmonella is not in the least bit pleasant at the best of times, and that bird had already done for one human who had dared to cross it. Now, given the tragedy of his sudden and unexpected departure from this world, you could be forgiven for thinking that it would be Sir Francis Bacon's spectral figure that returned to Highgate to bemoan the indignity of his demise. But you would be wrong in that assumption, for it is in fact the ghost of the chicken that is said to haunt Pond Square, albeit it would take the poor creature more than 300 years to find its way back to the location at which it took its place at the head of a long line of frozen fowl. There are no mentions of the spectral chicken of Pond Square prior to 1973, in which year newspapers across the country began to mention it. However, they were actually reviewing the first book to mention the ghostly visitant, Peter Underwood's Haunted London, published that year. In fact, all the accounts from those who are said to have encountered the phantom fowl that have appeared in books since, and which are now all over the internet, were first mentioned in Peter Underwood's book. There have been many reports of a spectral chicken, half running and half flying in circles and almost denuded of feathers, Underwood wrote. It is seen near a brick wall at dead of night, always in the winter months. In recent years, the shivering chicken has been seen at least 15 times, and no one keeps chickens these days in Pond Square. He then gives details of Mr. and Mrs. John Greenhill, who lived in Pond Square during the Second World War, and who saw the ghost chicken many times. It was a big whitish bird, Mrs. Greenhill reported. Many members of my family saw it on moonlit nights. Sometimes it would perch on the lower boughs of the tree opposite our house. One of the most oft-mentioned encounters with the ghost is that experienced by aircraftman Terence Long, who one night in December 1943 was walking through Pond Square when he heard the sound of horses' hooves and the grind of carriage wheels. There then came a loud shriek, and the next moment he saw a chicken dancing about in frenzied circles, half bald, flapping its wings and squawking, and seemingly shivering with cold, which any one of us would do if someone had stuffed a load of ice up our... But back to the story. Long looked around to see where the bird might have come from, and when he turned back, there was no sign of it. According to Peter Underwood, Long later met an air raid precautions fire watcher who informed him that the bird had been seen around the square for years, and that a few months before another man had tried to catch it, but it had vanished into a brick wall. Apparently there was a sighting in 1969 when a motorist whose car had broken down was crossing the square to seek assistance at one of the houses. As he walked, he suddenly noticed a huge white bird that was flapping its wings furiously and running round in circles, but making no sound. Thinking it might be hurt, he went to assist, but as he got closer, he saw that it was a chicken and that almost all the feathers had been plucked from its body. He looked round to see who could have done such a cruel thing, but on turning back, the bird had disappeared. The final sighting that Peter Underwood quotes was that of a young couple who were enjoying a good-night kiss in the square one night in February 1970, when a large featherless white bird suddenly dropped to the ground and began flapping round in a frenzied circle before disappearing into the darkness. Aside from these mentions in Peter Underwood's book, I can find no other accounts of people encountering the phantom chicken in Pond Square, and the inquiries I made of the locals I encountered there as to whether they had seen it met with blank stares and one or two unrepeatable phrases. But hey-ho, them's the breaks for us dedicated seekers of paranormal tales. Well, that brings to an end our visit to Pond Square. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It really does help. I'd love to hear your theories as to whether you think the ghost is genuine or not. I think you may have guessed my feelings about it. You've probably noticed a few chicken jokes have managed to creep in. I tried desperately to make a pun about bacon and eggs, but the muse simply wasn't upon me. However, if past experience has taught me anything, it is that you, dear viewers, are absolutely brilliant at coming up with puns, so please go to town with the worst quips you can think of. Until we meet again in the twilight world of the paranormal or the frozen chicken section in the local supermarket, dear viewer, stay safe, and when you get to bed tonight, do have very sweet and pleasant dreams. Now, what's for supper?